Hi everyone, I'm Anand Sitaram, Assistant Professor in the Computer Science Department at the State University of New York, Binghamton. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about how to review a research paper. This video is particularly tailored to reviewing papers in the field of computer science, but it's relevant to other fields as well. Now, in computer science, researchers submit papers to both conferences and journals. And this is different from a whole bunch of other fields because in computer science, conferences as well as journals are both rated very highly, and both conference and journal papers go through a rigorous review process. This is in contrast to some of the other fields where conference papers are mildly reviewed, whereas journal papers go through a rigorous review process. But this is not the case with computer science. So, when you're asked to review a research paper, you may get an invitation from a conference or from a journal. Now, what is the difference? The main difference lies in what is the outcome of the review process. In a conference, the main objective would be either to reject or accept a paper. So that would be the main goal. Usually there is no second round of review at a conference, though there might be a rebuttal process where the authors might submit some rebuttal to the reviews that you have posted, but it's mainly to accept or reject a paper. In contrast, in a journal, what you will have is there will be accept, there will be something called a major revision, or there will be something called a minor revision. Now, because these different options that are possible in a journal paper usually goes through multiple rounds of review at the same journal. So, for example, first a paper that is submitted is reviewed, and maybe the reviewers give some set of comments which need to be addressed. So it gets a major revision. After those comments have been addressed, maybe the reviewers once again take a look at the submitted manuscript and then decide that there are only some minor corrections to be made, which would then be a minor revision. Finally, the paper gets accepted. And so a journal is a more rigorous process in the sense that it takes longer duration to get a paper accepted. Now, in a conference paper, your decision would either be a reject or an accept. So this is from the perspective of the author who has submitted the manuscript. Now, from the perspective of the reviewer, it is slightly different because the way you review the paper is kind of guided by the outcomes. So first, let's look at a conference. Now, at a conference, a paper gets accepted or rejected. However, you are not going to just give an accept or a reject rating. There are multiple options at a conference as well. So I'm just going to write this conference here. So there are multiple options such as accept. So these are the ratings that you can give: accept, weak accept, weak reject, or reject. These are the ratings that the reviewer gives. And based on the collective set of reviews got from multiple reviewers, the conference chairs decide whether to accept the paper or reject the paper. For example, say a paper has 3 reviews and 2 reviewers give the paper accept, and 1 reviewer gives a weak accept. Now, because there are 2 accepts and weak accept, the conference organizers might agree to accept the paper and publish it at the conference. Sometimes you get maybe an accept from one reviewer, you get a weak accept from another reviewer, and a weak reject from another reviewer. Even then, the conference organizers might discuss and decide that this paper is worthy to be accepted at the conference and published there. So, when you write the review, you have to give any one of these 4 ratings. Of course, depending on the conference, these ratings can change. The names, I mean, sometimes you have borderline accept, reject, strong reject, but these are generally the cases that agree that are there. Now, now for now when you write the review, what should you look at? You should look at four things. One is the summary. Okay, so when you write the first thing is the summary. In the summary, you summarize the contributions of the authors. Now, once you've summarized the contributions, the where can you look to get a summary of the contributions? Basically, you can get it from the abstract or the intro. So the abstract and intro, the authors would have summarized their contributions. Now, the second thing, and it's fairly easy to write a summary of the paper. Next thing you should look at is the strengths of the paper. Now, every paper has some set of merits, maybe the problem that they're looking at, the solution. So you should talk about what is good about the paper. Now, when you're reviewing a paper, it is a natural tendency to try to find faults with the paper. And that is obviously going to be there, but you should always acknowledge the effort that the authors have put to writing this paper and submitting it. So you should spend some time being nice to the authors and telling them what they have, how their paper could contribute to the research community. Now, after you have highlighted the strengths, usually you should talk about the weaknesses of the paper. Now, sometimes when you are reviewing for the first time, it is hard to find weaknesses in a paper that has been submitted because you get intimidated by the amount of technical detail that is there in the paper. But every paper has weaknesses. Okay, this is something that you should keep in mind. Every paper has weaknesses. There is no paper that has been published which is perfect. Okay, because if it was is if it's perfect, then there will be no further research necessary in that area. So it has some set of limitations. And as a reviewer, it is your responsibility to find out the weaknesses. Now, what could be the weakness of a paper? Okay, first, the first one thing that you can talk about as a weakness is you should check related work. So you check the related work and see, which is basically the references, and check if the references are up to date. Have the authors cited the latest work in that field? Okay, then this is important because you may not be an expert in the particular paper that you are reviewing. Though it might fall in the broad area of research, it may not be specific to what you are working on. So you may not know all the related work in that field. So it is important to look at the references to see if the authors have cited relevant papers that have been published in the last 1 or 2 years. Then it is important to understand what void or what gap this paper fills. Now, it may not be clear what gap a paper actually fills. If a paper is incremental and it's just pushing and it's solving a well-addressed problem and it's looking at a well-addressed problem and trying to suggest an incremental solution, then the gap that it's filling is not that big and the paper would lack in novelty. So that is something that you should try to identify, whether it's a problem that's new or whether it is incremental. Okay. Then another thing that you should look at are the assumptions. Now, assumptions. What are the assumptions? What are the assumptions the authors make in the paper? Are those assumptions realistic? Sometimes assumptions may not be realistic. And in that case, that could be a weakness of the paper if it is not applicable in a real world setting. Then there could be proofs. So you should check the proofs or at least glance through the proofs to understand whether they are correct. So check proofs of theorems that are there in the paper. After you've done that, you should look at experiments. Now, in the experiments, you should see whether they're repeatable. You should check for repeatability. Have the authors provided enough information such that the experiments can be repeated? Okay, if that's not the case, that's something of a weakness, because and there's not enough information for another set of researchers to replicate the results in this paper. Okay, you should check if they have confidence intervals. Confidence intervals tell you if the results have been repeated for a large number of times and how much confidence you could place on the results that have been published in the paper. Okay, and you should also check if it's versus simulation, if the results are derived using simulation versus real world experiments. Now, if some experiments have been done in the real world, then they give greater credibility to the paper, whereas simulations have been done in a more controlled environment and the results may not necessarily carry over to the real world. Now, these are some ways in which you could identify the weaknesses of a paper. Once again, when you're writing about the weaknesses of a paper, be nice to the authors, tell them how their work can be improved, and don't just criticize their work. This is very important because you want the authors to be able to improve upon their work and then publish it at a later time. It's not to just critique their work and say that their work has these flaws. So keep that in mind when you're reviewing a paper. Now, after you've done this, the last section is very important, which is additional comments. Now, once that you have identified the weaknesses in the paper, you have to give additional comments, or you should. How could the paper be improved? The author submitted the paper hoping to get good feedback on their work. So you should spend that time giving the authors some feedback on what are the additional experiments that they could run, how they could maybe strengthen their models. So these are examples. You could also, if they have missed out certain references, you could point out some important references. And moreover, you could also give some constructive feedback on some of the assumptions. If they are not realistic, you could point them out and give some constructive feedback on how those assumptions could be strengthened to actually make it practical in the real world. So these are the things that you should consider. Now remember that we are talking about all this, so what we talked about were the summary, the strengths, the weakness, and the additional comments. Now once you get to this stage of a paper, you will have to finally give your rating. And recall that we talked about conferences and journals, and we were mainly talking about conference style papers, because conferences have this thing about accepting or rejecting a paper. So what you'll have to do is, at this stage, you'll have to also give your ratings. Now, when you give your ratings, every conference has an acceptance rate. Say most good conferences have acceptance rates within 20 to 30%. So 20 to 30%. So say you have 10 papers to review. That means that to adhere to the acceptance rate of the conference, you can only accept 2 to 3 papers. So that is what you should also try to do. So accept around 3 papers, because this would be in the ballpark of the acceptance rate of the conference. I know that lots of great papers get submitted to good conferences, and you might be tempted to accept all the papers if you are reviewing for the first time, but then that's not in sync with the acceptance rate. So you should accept around 2 to 3 papers if the acceptance rate has been 20 to 30%. Some conferences may have acceptance rate of 40%, then it will like go up to 44 papers out of 10. And sometimes, but this is not that you have to always adhere to this. Sometimes maybe you get a great batch of papers, so this can actually increase to 5 papers if you feel that all the papers that you got are really good. So you might want to accept more papers. Sometimes you get a batch of papers which are not that good. Then this would come down to maybe 1 paper. So you accept around 2 to 3 papers. Rest, depending on how they are, you give them weak reject or reject. So it's unfortunate those papers might actually be good, but you have to do a comparative study and figure out where they stand in comparison to the other papers that have been submitted and make this call whether it's a good paper that can be accepted to this conference or whether it falls short on some regard. And you should not just compare among the 10 papers, you should also compare with the history of this conference, kind of papers that have been published at the conference. Okay, so more kinds of papers published. So this is something you should take into account to judge whether this particular paper that you're reviewing deserves to get accepted or rejected. So different conferences have different scope and they value certain things more than others, and your review should be catered around this. Now, how long should be a review? So to give a constructive review, I strongly recommend writing around I would say 1500 characters to 2500 characters. This would be a bare minimum. Okay, you should write somewhere in that ballpark, because otherwise you are not being able to give good constructive feedback to the authors and you're not doing them a good justice. Okay, so this is all about conferences. Now let's go to journals. So for journals, the style will be similar. The style is going to be similar. We'll first talk about the strengths, the weakness, the summary, and additional comments. But then your ratings will be accept, reject, major revision, or minor revision. So in a journal, the ratings are in sync with what the authors are also suggested. So if you like the paper in its current form and you think that there is nothing more to do, you accept the paper. If you think that the paper is a not good fit and it needs a lot of work, you reject the paper. Otherwise, you give it a major revision or a minor revision. Now, majority of papers that get published in a journal go through multiple rounds of revision. So you first, usually they go to 1 or 2 rounds of major revision, then get a round or 2 of minor revision, and then get accepted. Now, when you give a paper a major revision, and the authors are also given a major revision, the authors can will usually submit a revised manuscript. Now, once the manuscript comes back, try to agree to review the paper. So you should agree to review the paper again, because in that revised manuscript, the authors would have addressed your comments. So agree to review revised manuscript, because otherwise the journal editor would have to find a new reviewer, and that is pretty painful, because then the new reviewer has no idea has not reviewed the paper earlier. So it generally is a good idea to go through this process completely with the with the author. So they will agree to review the revised manuscript, and once again, you do the same process again. Whether they have addressed your comments, if you're happy with the comments that have been addressed, so give the review back. It could once again be a major revision if they have only addressed some of your comments or you have additional questions. So that is the usual process. So overall, whether you are reviewing for a conference or a journal in computer science, be sure that to be nice to the authors, because ultimately you are also going to write papers and you want the reviewers to be nice to you. So be nice to the authors, give them constructive feedback, make every attempt to read all papers to the fullest. I know that there are lots of papers, so there is this tendency to not give complete attention to a paper and to read it sketchily, but so do give it enough time. So plan your calendar such that you have enough time to review a paper. With this, I'll stop. Thank you for watching.